So imagine an entire nation where half the population is under the age of 14.
Right.
And then imagine that same nation's entire economy, like the sum total of every single good and service produced by millions of people over an entire year generates less revenue than a single mid-sized regional hospital in the United States.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that scale.
Exactly. Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we aren't just looking at a passing news headline. We are sitting here with our resident data expert to look at over 6 decades of data.
Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here to dig into this.
We're mapping the life, the struggles, and the very real structural realities of the Central African Republic.
Yeah, and for anyone listening, this data set is essentially a masterclass in the anatomy of a fragile state.
It really is.
We are looking at an incredibly comprehensive research report. It tracks the Central African Republic, or the CAF, from 1960 all the way to 2023.
Over 60 years of data.
Right. And it synthesizes millions of data points across 4 distinct dimensions. We've got the economic, the social, the governance, and the environmental.
So it's not just one angle.
No, not at all. It forces us to look past those simplified 30-second news clips of political conflict. We get to ask, what are the actual mathematical bottlenecks preventing a society from developing?
And that is the mission of this deep dive. We want to read those bottlenecks.
Exactly.
Because when a country struggles to find its footing for over half a century, it's not just a matter of bad luck.
Definitely not.
The causes are deeply buried. They're in demographic weight, collapsed supply chains, institutional decay, and environmental vulnerability. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
I think we should start with the very foundation of any nation, which is its people.
I agree. The demographic data is really where this structural narrative begins.
Right?
Because if you visualize the population of a highly developed nation, say like Japan or Germany, the demographic chart looks somewhat like an onion or maybe a kite.
A kite, yeah.
Yeah, there is a smaller base of children, a massive bulge in the middle representing the working age adults, and then a tapering top of the elderly.
Right, standard demographic transition stuff.
Exactly. But the Central African Republic's demographic chart is a completely different geometric shape. It is the profoundly wide, completely flat-based pyramid.
So it's just incredibly bottom-heavy.
Very. As of 2023, 49% of the entire population is between the ages of 0 and 14.
Wow. Wait, so literally half the country is essentially in middle school or younger.
Correct. Half the country. And when you look at the downstream economic effects of that, you immediately run into what we call the youth dependency ratio.
Okay, break that down for us.
So this is a metric that compares the number of youths, meaning anyone under 15, to the working age population, which demographers generally define as ages 15 to 64.
Right.
In the CAF, that ratio is hovering right near 100%.
100%. So for every single adult theoretically capable of working, there's a child that needs to be fed, clothed, and educated.
Yes. Every single one. And the economic consequence of a 100% dependency ratio is severe. What's fascinating here is, well, maybe fascinating isn't the right word, but it creates what economists call a massive crowding out effect on national capital.
Crowding out effect. Let me make sure I'm translating this correctly for everyone.
Go for it.
If I look at this from a microeconomic level, like just a single household, imagine a family where only one person can find work and they have to support 5 dependents.
Right. A huge burden.
Every single dollar of that paycheck is going to be instantly vaporized by immediate consumption. Buying food, paying for basic shelter, replacing worn-out shoes, there is zero surplus.
Zero.
Like if the roof caves in, they can't fix it. And there is certainly no money left over to put into a savings account, let alone invest in a tractor to farm more efficiently or pay for a university degree.
That is the exact mechanism, just scaled up to a national level.
That's just survival mode.
Entirely. Because savings are the fundamental engine of investment. For a country to build paved roads, electrical grids, deep water ports, or modern telecommunications networks, it needs massive amounts of capital investment.
Which usually comes from the citizens, right?
Yes, that capital has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And traditionally comes from the collective domestic savings of the population, mediated through banks.
Right.
But when 49% of your population is consuming resources without producing economic value, domestic savings drop to near zero.
Because they just can't save.
Right. The country literally cannot afford to build its own future because it is entirely consumed with surviving the present.
But I mean, development economists usually talk about a youth bulge as a good thing, don't they?
They do, under certain conditions.
Because I feel like I'm constantly reading about the demographic dividend.
Hmm.
The narrative is usually that a massive generation of young people is this, incredible latent engine for industrialization.
Yeah.
Like we saw that in East Asia in the 70s and 80s. South Korea and Taiwan rode that massive wave of young workers into the global manufacturing supply chain.
Yeah, the demographic dividend is a real phenomenon, but it is not automatic. It is highly, highly conditional.
Conditional on what?
A youth bulge only translates into an economic dividend if a country possesses three prerequisites: the educational infrastructure to train those young people, the healthcare infrastructure to keep them productive, and the capital investment to build the factories and offices for them to work in.
Which we just established they don't have the savings to build.
Exactly. If you have a massive youth population but absolutely no infrastructure to absorb them into productive, formal labor, the dividend morphs into a demographic bomb.
Wow.
It becomes a source of profound socioeconomic strain and potential instability.
And the data shows another layer to this strain, which I think makes the whole situation even more volatile. The life expectancy at birth, specifically for women, is critically low. It's sitting at approximately 52 years.
Yeah, that creates a devastating interaction with the youth bulge. When life expectancy is that low, the structural integrity of the society is deeply compromised. You are continually losing your most experienced workers.
Right. The mentors, the people who have spent 20 or 30 years mastering a trade or understanding how to manage a community or even just knowing how to navigate complex agricultural cycles.
Exactly. The continual premature loss of the older generation means there is a massive deficit of generational knowledge accumulation.
So you're just losing all that institutional memory.
Yes. So you are left with a society defined by a missing middle. You have a massive base of dependent children and a deeply stressed, under-resourced cohort of young adults,
Who are just forced to carry the entire weight of the nation's future.
and often without the guidance or stability of an older generation.
Okay, so if the population is this staggeringly young, and domestic savings are effectively non-existent because every resource goes to immediate caloric survival, how does the macroeconomy even function? Like, what does the GDP of a system like that actually look like?
Well, it looks incredibly volatile and remarkably small.
Let's get into those numbers.
When we examine the total gross domestic product, the total value of all goods and services produced, the absolute numbers are just stark. In 2013, the GDP was approximately $1.69 billion.
Billion, with a B.
Right. And by 2023, it had grown to roughly $2.22 billion.
A $2.2 billion economy for a sovereign nation of millions of people.
It's tiny.
And looking at the growth rate curve that maps those years, I mean, it is giving me a whiplash.
The volatility is extreme.
This is not a story of slow, steady progress. It's a series of erratic swings, completely defined by a single catastrophic plunge in 2013. The data records a negative 36.6% drop in GDP growth in that single year.
Yeah. The magnitude of that number really cannot be overstated.
We need to pause here because the terminology we use in the West, words like recession or economic downturn, they completely fail to capture this reality. If the US or the UK economy contracts by 1 or 2% over a few quarters, it's a headline crisis. Central banks panic, interest rates are slashed, governments debate stimulus packages.
Right.
A drop of over 36% isn't a recession. That is an economic vaporization.
It is the mathematical signature of a systemic collapse.
Yeah.
When we interpret the historical context of 2013 purely through the lens of this economic data, we are seeing the complete cessation of physical security.
Right, because an economy isn't just some abstract concept on a spreadsheet. It's physical movement. It's farmers taking trucks full of cassava to a market. It's shopkeepers opening their doors.
Exactly. And when political stability fails entirely, that physical movement stops. Supply chains just freeze.
People are just stuck.
Farmers are too terrified to leave their villages to harvest crops or travel to markets. The minor amount of foreign capital that might be operating in the country immediately flees.
It just evaporates.
Domestic trade grinds to a halt. That negative 36.6% figure is what happens when the foundational prerequisite for an economy basic physical safety is removed from the equation.
And the hangover from a collapse like that is incredibly long. It's not like you just bounce back to normal the next year.
No, the recovery takes decades.
You can see the long-term scarring in the per capita numbers. The per capita GDP is stubbornly trapped in this narrow, stagnant band between $400 and $500.
Yeah.
For 2023, the data pins it at about $417. That keeps the SIA firmly below the World Bank's low-income warning line.
And being trapped below that specific low-income threshold is dangerous because it severely restricts the fiscal capacity of the state.
How so?
Well, if the average citizen is only generating $417 of economic value a year, the government cannot possibly extract enough tax revenue to fund the state.
Right, there's just nothing to tax.
You cannot fund a modern civil service, build a nationwide power grid, or maintain a standardized education system on a tax base that small. The state becomes fiscally hollow.
Now, I know someone listening to this might be doing the mental math and thinking, well, $417 goes a lot further in a rural developing nation than it does in London or New York.
Sure, the cost of living argument.
Right, a dollar buys more local goods there, and the data accounts for that, providing the purchasing power parity, or PPP, figures.
It does.
But even when you adjust for the local cost of living using PPP, the per capita income only bumps up to about $1,300 international dollars.
Which is still incredibly low.
Yeah, that still leaves the average citizen with incredibly weak purchasing power. It is still a portrait of deep systemic poverty.
And to understand the mechanics of why that income is so fiercely trapped, we have to dissect the actual structure of the economy. What are these people actually doing to generate that $2.2 billion?
The breakdown by sector.
Right. The data breaks down the value added by agriculture, industry, and services. And the structural bottleneck jumps right off the page. Agriculture persistently accounts for between 25% and 30% of the total GDP.
A quarter to a third of the entire national economy is just basic farming.
Yes. And it is vital to distinguish what kind of agriculture this is. We are not talking about highly mechanized, GPS-guided, high-yield export farming.
Right, not massive industrial farms.
No, this is largely informal, low-yield subsistence agriculture. It is labor-intensive and incredibly inefficient.
And while agriculture is dominating the economy, the manufacturing sector is actively vanishing.
That's the concerning part.
The data shows manufacturing dropping from 19% of the GDP down to just 11%. So we aren't just looking at a country struggling to industrialize. We are looking at a country experiencing active deindustrialization.
And deindustrialization is a massive red flag for sustainable development.
Why is that so dangerous?
The standard path to national wealth involves pulling labor out of low-productivity agriculture and moving it into higher productivity manufacturing. You stop selling raw materials and you start selling processed goods.
Because the value is in the processing.
Yeah.
It's the difference between selling a pile of raw cotton for pennies versus having a factory that spins that cotton into yarn, weaves it into fabric, and sews it into a shirt.
Right. The value chain.
The shirt sells for exponentially more, and that factory provides formal wages to hundreds of workers, which builds a middle class.
Precisely. But when your manufacturing sector is shrinking to 11%, you are locked into selling the raw cotton or the raw coffee or the raw timber.
You're just stuck.
You are trapped at the very bottom of the global value chain. And this creates a severe macroeconomic vulnerability. An agriculture-dependent state with no industrial base is entirely at the mercy of forces it cannot control.
Like global commodity prices and local weather.
Yes. If the global market price for your primary export crop drops by 20%, your national income takes a massive hit, and you have no domestic industrial sector to act as a shock absorber.
Wow.
If a drought destroys the harvest, the entire economy contracts. The volatility we see in the GDP is directly tied to this lack of economic complexity.
So we have a collapsed macroeconomy, a vanishing industrial sector, and a heavy reliance on subsistence farming.
That's the baseline, yeah.
How does this abstract data translate to the daily lived reality of the workforce? Because, people still have to eat. They still have to work.
Right.
The data on the labor market maps this out, and the metric that stands out the most is the rate of vulnerable employment.
Right. Vulnerable employment. In highly developed economies, macroeconomic health is often judged by the unemployment rate. If unemployment hits 8 or 9%, it's a huge crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
But in deeply fragile states, formal unemployment is almost a useless metric.
Because nobody can afford to be unemployed. There are no unemployment benefits. If you don't work, you literally starve.
Exactly. Therefore, the critical metric is the quality and security of the work people are forced into. Vulnerable employment measures the percentage of workers who are own account workers or unpaid family workers.
Basically, the informal economy.
Yes. These are individuals operating entirely in the informal economy. And the rates in the CAF are universally high, though heavily gendered. Over 85% of women are in vulnerable employment, alongside roughly 74% of men.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The data notes that over 80% of male workers are self-employed.
Right?
And I think this is where a lot of Western listeners might trip up on the terminology. When we hear self-employed in a model context, we picture a freelance software developer or an architect who runs their own firm or someone driving an Uber.
Sure, it sounds somewhat positive.
It implies a level of autonomy and entrepreneurialism. But self-employed in the context of this data means something entirely different, doesn't it?
It is a fundamentally different economic reality. In this context, self-employed means an individual farming a tiny plot of land by hand just to feed their family, occasionally selling the surplus by the side of a dirt road.
Right.
It means engaging in artisanal mining with a shovel. It means selling single pieces of fruit or used clothing in an informal market.
There are no formal contracts. There is no guaranteed minimum wage.
None. There is no paid sick leave, no workplace safety regulations, no pension plans, and absolutely zero social safety nets.
Nothing to fall back on.
If an informal agricultural worker twists their ankle and cannot walk to the field, their income immediately drops to zero. The vulnerability is absolute.
And this structural lack of formal employment, this absolute poverty trap, drives one of the most sobering statistics in the entire report.
The child labor data.
Yeah.
No.
When adults cannot generate enough formal income to meet the basic caloric needs of their household, they have to deploy every available asset to survive.
Which leads us to the child labor data.
It's incredibly grim. The economic participation rate of children between the ages of 7 and 14 hits above 20% in some of the recorded years.
1 in 5 children, younger than 14, working.
It is the ultimate tragic manifestation of the low-income trap. In a household living on the edge of starvation, education becomes an unaffordable luxury.
Because they just need the hands to work. Right. The opportunity cost of sending a 10-year-old to school is the loss of the meager income or agricultural labor that child could provide.
Wow.
So children are pulled from the classroom and pushed into the informal sector.
Which provides a tiny bit of short-term relief for the family. Maybe they eat that week. But it completely destroys the long-term economic potential of the nation.
Completely.
Because a 10-year-old who is working in an artisanal mine or a cassava field is not learning the literacy and numeracy skills required to operate factory machinery or manage an office or code software 10 years later.
Exactly.
They're being permanently locked into the exact same cycle of vulnerable, informal employment as their parents.
And that's the core issue. The labor data is a perfect mirror of the macroeconomic data. The deindustrialization of the economy means there are no formal jobs.
Right.
The lack of formal jobs forces the population into informal, vulnerable employment. This deep informality breeds extreme poverty. The extreme poverty forces families into child labor.
It just cascades.
And the child labor prevents the accumulation of the human capital necessary to ever industrialize the economy in the future. It is a closed, vicious loop.
And understanding that child labor dynamic gives us the perfect lens to look at the human capital crisis. Because the data on education and health explains exactly why this cycle is so hard to break.
It really highlights the systemic barriers.
Let's look at the education bottlenecks first. The foundational metric is the primary school net enrollment rate. The data shows it's stuck perpetually between 50% and 60%.
Meaning nearly half of the nation's children are not even making it into a basic primary school classroom. They are entirely disconnected from the formal learning system from day one.
And within the 50% who do manage to enroll, the disparities are massive. The Gender Parity Index, or GPI, for secondary school shows a severe structural imbalance. In 2001, it was recorded as low as 0.51.
So the Gender Parity Index is a vital indicator of social equity and future economic potential. It is a ratio where a score of 1.0 represents perfect equality between boys and girls. A score of 0.51 means that for every 100 boys enrolled in secondary school, there are only 51 girls.
And the downstream effects of that are massive. If we connect this to the vulnerable employment data from earlier, where 85% of women are in vulnerable jobs, it's obvious why.
The correlation is undeniable.
You are systematically underskilling half of your potential workforce. Furthermore, decades of developmental research show that a mother's education level is the single highest predictor of a child's health and future educational attainment.
Yes, the intergenerational impact.
When you deny women secondary education, you are hobbling the next generation before it's even born.
But the educational bottleneck gets even narrower. Even for the children who do access the system, the attrition rate is staggering.
What do the numbers look like?
The data indicates that junior high completion rates are an abysmal 11% to 13%.
11 to 13%. Wow. Let's actually visualize the mechanics of that 11 to 13% completion rate, because I think that is the most dangerous statistic for the country's economic future.
It paints a very clear picture.
Imagine a theoretical cohort of 100 kids born in a specific year. Only about 55 of them even start primary school.
Right, based on the enrollment rates.
Because of the gender disparity, a chunk of the girls drop out early. By the time this cohort reaches the end of junior high, only 11 or 12 of the original 100 kids are graduating with basic middle school level literacy and math skills.
Yeah, that's the reality.
What happens to the other 88 kids? They are absorbed into the informal agricultural sector.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that 11% completion rate represents a massive talent fault line.
A talent fault line. I like that phrase.
When we talk about the strategic need to attract foreign direct investment or build a manufacturing base, we have to look at the reality of the workforce.
You can't just build a factory out of nowhere.
Exactly. You cannot build a modern service sector. You cannot attract international tech investment, and you cannot even run advanced mechanized commercial farming if 89% of your workforce lacks a basic junior high education.
The foundational skills just aren't there.
The human capital simply does not exist in sufficient density to support economic complexity.
And it's incredibly difficult to stay in school or retain any information if you are chronically ill.
Absolutely.
The health data operates in tandem with the education data to suppress human capital. The historical under-5 mortality rates documented here are devastating. They range between 170 and 220 per 1,000 live births in past decades.
Which means historically, nearly 1 in 5 children did not survive to see their 5th birthday.
1 in 5? That's heartbreaking.
It is. And while the data shows a gradual improvement over time, the rates remain critically high relative to global standards. The modeled estimates for maternal mortality also indicate that it remains among the highest globally. The biological act of giving birth is a highly dangerous event there.
And we also have to factor in the infectious disease burden. The prevalence of HIV in the 15 to 49 demographic, which is the core working age population we discussed earlier, peaked at over 6%.
This creates a compounding human capital crisis. High mortality rates and high disease burdens shatter family structures, they create orphans, and they decimate the daily productivity of the workforce.
And the data points to why, right?
Yes. The data reveals the mechanisms behind these health outcomes. It points directly to a severe lack of medical resources. The number of doctors and hospital beds per 1,000 people is virtually non-existent compared to international standards.
The lack of doctors is glaring, but I want to look at a different data point that really contextualizes this health crisis. The data shows that access to safe sanitation and clean water in rural areas is near 5.7%.
That is perhaps the most revealing statistic regarding the health crisis.
Because when we think of public health, we naturally picture hospitals, MRI machines, doctors in white coats, pharmaceuticals. We think of medicine.
Right, the clinical side.
But looking at that 5.7% sanitation access rate made me realize that public health fundamentally is an infrastructure issue. It's a civil engineering issue.
Yes, preventative infrastructure.
If 94% of your rural population cannot access clean drinking water or safely dispose of human waste, building a state-of-the-art hospital only addresses the symptom.
You're just putting a Band-Aid on it.
You are constantly treating waterborne diseases, cholera, dysentery, that simply shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah.
You cannot medicate your way out of a lack of basic plumbing.
That is a crucial distinction.
Yeah.
The foundation of public health is not the doctor. It is the civil engineer. It is the ability to provide clean water.
Right.
It is the reliable electricity required to run a cold chain for vaccines so they don't spoil in the heat. It is the paved road network required for an ambulance to reach a rural clinic.
And the profound lack of this physical infrastructure points us directly to the next dimension of the data, which is governance.
Right, the political framework.
Because it begs the ultimate question. Why is the infrastructure so poor? Why hasn't the state paved the roads, built the water treatment plants, or funded the schools?
And to answer that, we have to examine the structural integrity of the state itself through the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI.
Tell us about the WGI.
So the WGI is a critical data set because it measures the quality of how authority is exercised. It looks at political stability, control of corruption, rule of law, and government effectiveness. And it scores countries using percentiles.
And the percentiles for the CAF are incredibly low.
Very low.
Looking objectively at the data for political stability and the absence of violence, the country is perpetually languishing in the bottom fifth percentile globally.
To clarify the metric, being in the bottom fifth percentile means that 95% of all other measured countries on Earth have higher political stability and lower levels of violence.
Wow.
It is essentially the baseline definition of extreme state fragility. The data for control of corruption fluctuates slightly over the decades, but rarely rises above the 10th percentile.
And the metrics for the rule of law and government effectiveness have actively deteriorated. The data maps them sliding from an already very low 11th percentile down to below the 5th percentile.
So if we overlay these governance charts with the economic charts we discussed earlier, the correlation is absolute.
It's striking. If you literally stack the line graph for governance rankings on top of the GDP growth chart, they mirror each other perfectly.
Exactly.
There is a massive sheer drop in all the governance and stability rankings right around 2013, which perfectly aligns with that catastrophic 36.6% plunge in GDP.
Looking objectively at the empirical data, without evaluating the specific political actors or ideologies involved in the country's history, the conclusion is unavoidable.
What's the conclusion?
Political instability is the primary driver of state failure. Conflict does not just destroy physical capital like bridges and buildings. It erodes the invisible institutions necessary for economic recovery.
Take the rule of law metric, for example. If the rule of law is in the bottom fifth percentile, it means the judicial system cannot reliably function. If a foreign company wants to build a textile factory, they need to sign contracts for land, for construction, for labor.
Standard business requirements.
But if they cannot enforce a contract in a court of law, if their property rights aren't guaranteed, they simply will not invest the capital. The risk is too high.
Exactly. And look at the government effectiveness score, which also sits below the 5th percentile.
What does that measure specifically?
This metric measures the quality of public services, the capability of the civil service, and its independence from political pressures. When this score collapses, the state loses its basic mechanical ability to administer the country.
Which leads us to the core paradox of a fragile state.
Yes, this raises an important question.
How does a government function at all? If the domestic economy is largely a $2.2 billion informal agricultural base, where 80% of men are self-employed subsistence farmers, the state cannot effectively collect taxes.
It's nearly impossible.
You can tax corporate profits, and you can tax formal wages via payroll, but you cannot easily tax a farmer selling cassava by the side of a dirt road.
Right.
If the tax base is effectively zero, and the government effectiveness is too low to collect what little taxes are owed, how does the state survive?
It cannot survive internally. It is forced to look outward. And the data clearly demonstrates this pivot. The nation relies almost entirely on the outside world.
It relies on a lifeline.
A massive one.
The data shifts to tracking external aid, and this is where the sheer scale of international dependence becomes staggering.
The primary metric here is Net Official Development Assistance, or ODA.
Okay, define ODA for us.
This encompasses grants, concessional loans, and technical assistance from international donors, governments, and NGOs aimed at promoting economic development and welfare.
And the chart shows this ODA skyrocketing immediately after 2014.
Which is the direct systemic response to the 2013 collapse we tracked in both the GDP and governance data. The international community stepped in.
So it was an emergency response?
Yes. That massive spike in ODA signals the peak of peacekeeping operations, humanitarian aid, and emergency intervention, attempting to artificially stabilize the country post-crisis.
But the truly shocking part isn't just the sheer volume of the aid, it's the ratio of that aid to the country's own internal building capacity.
Right, the proportions are key here.
The data reveals that in some years, the net ODA received by the CAF exceeded 100% of its gross capital formation.
We need to define gross capital formation to understand how severe that ratio is.
Okay.
Gross capital formation represents the total value of additions to fixed assets in an economy. It is the physical building of the nation, laying new roads, constructing schools, building hospitals, purchasing industrial machinery, expanding the electrical grid.
So what does this all mean, if I'm reading the mechanics of this correctly? If the foreign aid coming in exceeds 100% of the gross capital formation, that means the domestic economy is generating absolutely zero surplus to invest in its own physical future.
That is precisely what it means. It means that every single new brick laid for a clinic, every new kilometer of paved road, every new tractor imported is effectively being bankrolled by external foreign funds.
So they aren't building anything themselves.
The international community is not just assisting the government. In terms of physical infrastructure development, it is replacing the government.
And that is a terrifyingly fragile position for a sovereign nation to be in. Let's upgrade the analogy we used earlier.
Okay.
It's like a household where the parents have lost their jobs and they are entirely dependent on their neighbors to buy their groceries and pay for their roof repairs.
Right.
As long as the neighbors are feeling generous, the family survives.
Yeah.
But what happens if the neighbors experience their own financial crisis? What happens if global donor priorities shift to a new conflict in a different part of the world and those aid budgets shrink?
The development of the country simply halts. The life support machine is unplugged. That is the fragile balance the data highlights.
Yeah.
The state has almost no internal resilience.
Not at all.
And we see this fragility extending to their macroeconomic buffers, specifically debt and reserves. Historically, the burden was crushing. In the 2000s, the foreign debt stock exceeded 100% of the gross national income.
They owed more money to foreign creditors than the entire nation earned in a year.
Yes. However, the data does show a significant engineered improvement on this specific front.
Oh, good. How did they fix it?
Through international debt relief programs, primarily the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries, or HIPC initiative, that massive debt stock was systematically reduced. As of 2023, it sits at a much more manageable 35% of GNI.
Which is a relief. They don't have a massive unpayable credit card bill hanging over their heads anymore.
It is a relief, but it is accompanied by a major caveat. While the debt burden has been lowered, the data explicitly notes that the country's total financial reserves, including gold, are incredibly scarce.
So they don't have the massive credit card debt, but they also have absolutely zero emergency savings in the bank.
Exactly. They have no macroeconomic buffer.
So if anything goes wrong,
If a global financial shock occurs, for example, a war on another continent that causes the global price of fuel or imported grain to spike by 40%, the CAF has no financial reserves to subsidize those imports. They can't stabilize their local currency or protect their citizens from the price shock.
they are completely exposed to the wind of global markets.
Entirely exposed.
This illustrates the immense danger of becoming a permanent emergency aid recipient.
Yeah.
The external aid acts as a tourniquet. It keeps the patient alive, it provides the basic calories and medicine to prevent total systemic collapse, but it does not cure the underlying disease.
Right.
Pumping ODA into a country does not automatically build the resilient domestic industries, the local tax base, or the human capital required to eventually replace that aid.
And to move away from that aid dependence requires a massive structural pivot. A country must transition from receiving humanitarian grants to attracting productive foreign direct investment.
Which brings us back to governance.
Exactly. As we establish, foreign capital will not flow into a country where the rule of law is in the bottom 5th percentile and contracts cannot be enforced. It is an interlocking puzzle.
Well, the immediate visceral crises, the collapsed GDP, the political instability, the reliance on foreign aid naturally command all the attention. The data tracking the environmental and resource metrics shows a creeping long-term threat that is largely flying under the radar.
The environmental data is crucial because it reveals how the tactics used for short-term survival are actively destroying long-term national wealth.
What's a good example of that from the report?
For instance, the data indicates that greenhouse gas emissions, specifically excluding land use change, are steadily rising.
Which seems completely counterintuitive at first glance.
Right, given the lack of industry.
Yeah, we established earlier that this country is suffering from severe deindustrialization. Manufacturing has shrunk to 11% of GDP. They don't have massive coal-fired power plants or sprawling heavy industry. So what is driving the rising emissions?
The data attributes it primarily to agriculture and waste. It is the byproduct of incredibly low-efficiency farming practices, the slashing and burning of land to clear it for crops, and the profound lack of modern municipal waste management systems.
So it's just burning and waste.
Yes, and this leads to what might be the most tragic irony in the entire report.
What is it?
The data states that 100% of the population is exposed to PM 2.5 levels that exceed the World Health Organization's air quality standards.
100% of the population. Let's remind everyone, PM 2.5 refers to fine particulate matter. These are microscopic particles in the air that can penetrate deep into the respiratory system and enter the bloodstream, causing severe cardiovascular and respiratory diseases.
Right, it's incredibly toxic.
The tragedy is that a population entirely bypassed by the global industrial revolution, a population that hasn't reaped any of the wealth, the infrastructure, or the modern conveniences of heavy industry, is still suffering from 100% toxic air exposure.
It's a cruel paradox.
And it's largely due to indoor air pollution from burning biomass like wood and charcoal just to cook their daily meals, combined with agricultural burning. They are enduring the severe environmental health consequences of extreme poverty, which, as the data shows, can be just as pervasive as the pollution from a modernized industrial state.
And the economic cost of this environmental reality is quantifiable.
How so?
The data tracks the net depletion of forests and energy consumption, demonstrating increasing losses in a metric called adjusted net savings.
Adjusted net savings. Okay, so if I'm understanding the underlying math here, this isn't just a standard cash flow statement. It's essentially an environmental and human penalty applied to the standard GDP, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
Because traditional GDP just claps its hands and records a profit when you cut down a forest and sell the wood.
That is the exact distinction. Traditional economic metrics like GDP are aggressively blind to resource depletion. They measure production, regardless of the cost.
Right.
Adjusted net savings attempts to measure a country's true rate of wealth creation. It takes the gross national savings, adds investments in human capital like education, and then subtracts the depletion of natural resources and the damages from pollution.
I see. So if you clear-cut 1,000 acres of ancient forest and export the timber, your GDP goes up for that specific year. But your adjusted net savings might plummet because you just permanently liquidated a national asset without replacing it.
Precisely. The data shows that forest rents, the revenue derived from harvesting timber, are being continuously depleted, but that revenue is not being reinvested into sustainable physical or human capital.
So where does the money go?
It just disappears into immediate consumption. The timber money isn't being used to build universities or pave national highways. They're liquidating their long-term natural wealth merely to fund their short-term survival.
Just burning the furniture to stay warm.
Exactly. It is an environmentally and economically unsustainable trajectory. You cannot burn down your house to keep warm and expect to have shelter tomorrow.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this massive data set. We have dissected the demographic weight, the economic volatility, the informal labor trap, the human capital deficits, the governance failures, and the environmental risks.
There's a lot of interconnecting pieces.
It is. The final synthesis of the report maps out a strategic path forward. It presents a framework that looks like a sequential spiral of development.
The sequencing of this strategic path is the most critical takeaway. When a state is fragile across every single dimension, the instinct is to try and fix everything simultaneously.
Right, just throw money at everything.
But the data dictates a strict, non-negotiable hierarchy of needs. You cannot skip steps.
According to the data, step one is absolute. Security is the prerequisite for everything else.
We saw this empirical truth in the 2013 data overlay. Economic activity, school enrollment, and public health initiatives all freeze when political stability drops into the bottom 5th percentile.
Yeah, that 36% GDP drop proved it.
You cannot attract foreign capital to build a factory if you cannot physically guarantee that the factory won't be destroyed. You cannot improve the 11% junior high completion rate if teachers are not safe traveling to the schools. Security is the bedrock upon which all other data points rely.
Okay, so once that baseline of security is established, the data points to step two. Human capital must be aggressively developed to break the generational poverty cycle.
This requires direct, targeted interventions against the bottlenecks we identified. You must raise the primary enrollment rate far above that 50% stagnation.
And you have to keep them in school.
Right. You must drastically reduce the under 5 mortality rate, and you absolutely must correct the gender parity index. An economy cannot modernize or transition into complex manufacturing if half of its population is sick, chronically undereducated, and trapped in vulnerable informal labor.
So, security allows the children to safely attend school. The health and education infrastructure builds a capable, literate workforce. That capable workforce then allows for step 3, reducing external dependence by attracting foreign direct investment.
Currently, the state is surviving on ODA foreign humanitarian aid. The strategic goal is to shift that reliance from aid to productive investment.
But investors need guarantees.
Exactly. Foreign investors are entirely rational. They will only bring their capital if they see a capable, healthy workforce ready to be employed and, crucially, a measurable improvement in the rule of law. They need a functional judicial system to ensure their investments are legally protected.
Which leads to the final step in the spiral, industrial upgrade.
Once you have physical security, a literate workforce, and foreign capital flowing in under a reliable legal framework, you can finally execute structural transformation.
That's when you start moving up the value chain.
Yes, you can begin to pull the workforce out of low-yield, vulnerable subsistence agriculture. You can reverse the trend of deindustrialization. The country can start building factories to process its own raw materials, capturing the value domestically and organically building a resilient middle class that can finally generate the tax revenue needed to fund the state.
Security brings the rule of law. The rule of law brings investment. Investment builds physical infrastructure. Infrastructure supports education and health. And health and education supply the workforce needed for industry.
It is a spiral that continuously reinforces itself.
The ultimate mission for the Central African Republic, as dictated by the data, is completing the transition from an emergency aid recipient into a sovereign entity capable of resilient growth.
It is a monumental multi-generational task, but mapping these structural bottlenecks through rigorous data, understanding the precise mechanisms of why they exist, is the first necessary step toward dismantling them.
It really is. We've covered 6 decades of incredibly complex data today, and we've mapped out how utterly dependent the SIA economy currently is on basic informal agriculture. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Something that builds on the environmental data we just discussed, but looks toward an uncertain future. We established that the CIF has absolutely no macroeconomic buffer, no financial reserves to absorb a shock.
Right, zero reserves.
And we know that their entire survival is currently pegged to subsistence farming. But with global climate change fundamentally altering historical weather patterns, shifting the rainy seasons, and increasing drought frequency across sub-Saharan Africa, could environmental volatility become the ultimate uncontrollable spark for future political instability?
That is a very real threat.
Even if they execute the perfect strategy, even if they improve governance, secure the rule of law, and build human capital, can a fragile state truly build resilience if the very ground it relies on simply stops producing food?
That is the defining existential question. It's the variable that could disrupt the entire developmental spiral, not just for the CAF, but for dozens of fragile agrarian states in the coming decades.
It forces you to look at a simple agricultural GDP chart with a lot more apprehension, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Thank you for joining us on this intense, data-driven exploration. We hope this deep dive equips you to look past the simplified narratives and think a little more critically the next time you hear a news headline about a fragile state. The diagnosis is never simple, but if you look closely enough, the data always reveals the underlying mechanics of the story.